For the longest time, the United States just watched from the sidelines as war absolutely devoured Europe and Asia. A really powerful sense of isolationism kept the nation out of the fight. But that all changed, literally in a single morning. So let's dive into the story of how America was plunged into this global conflict and ultimately helped turn the tide of World War II. And these words, you've probably heard them before. They are, of course, from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He said them right after the shocking Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. And really, this single event was the blow that just shattered American isolationism once and for all. And wow, did things happen fast after that? It was like a chain reaction. December 7th, the attack happens. The very next day, Congress answers Roosevelt's call and declares war on Japan. But Japan wasn't in this alone. Within a week, the U.S. had also declared war on Germany and Italy. And that right there is the moment two separate wars officially merged into one massive, truly global conflict. Okay, so America's officially in the war. What's the first move? Well, the first critical steps were all about securing the seas and getting American troops some vital combat experience. And that strategy led them first to the rough seas of the Atlantic, and then to the deserts of North Africa. Hitler knew that Britain's survival completely depended on American supplies, so he unleashed his U-boat wolf packs with a simple order: sink everything crossing the Atlantic. And for a while, it was absolutely devastating. But the Allies had a powerful response. See, British codebreakers managed to crack Germany's encrypted radio codes, this massive surge of intelligence they called Ultra, and it gave them a huge edge. You combine that with new tech like sonar and depth charges, and the tide started to turn. By 1942, the Allies were actually sinking U-boats faster than Germany could even build them. All right, so the Atlantic is getting safer. Now it's time for American boots to hit the ground. In November of 1942, the first combat troops land in Morocco. The plan was this giant pincer movement. You had the Americans pushing east, while the British forces, who were fresh off a huge win at El Alamein, pushed west. And you know what? The strategy worked brilliantly. By 1943, the Allies had completely squeezed the Axis forces right out of Africa. With North Africa secured, the Allies looked to the European mainland. But this next phase of the war, it was going to be a brutal, grinding fight. This is where optimistic strategies would collide with a very, very harsh reality, both on the ground in Italy and up in the skies over Germany. So at a conference in Casablanca, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he convinces Roosevelt of his plan to invade Italy. The idea was to attack what he famously called the soft underbelly of Axis-controlled Europe. It sounded pretty good on paper, kind of a straightforward path right into the heart of the Reich. Yeah, about that soft underbelly, turns out it was anything but. Italy's terrain is narrow and mountainous, which is basically a defender's dream. Progress was just agonizingly slow, and the fighting started to look a lot like the brutal trench warfare of World War I. Landings like the one at Anzio became these bloody traps, and Allied forces suffered just immense casualties. The slog through Italy was a costly, brutal, and long campaign. At the same time, a whole different war was being fought in the skies. The Allied plan was simple, but brutal. Bomb Germany around the clock. The American Army Air Force would hit industrial targets with precision strikes during the day, and then Britain's Royal Air Force would conduct these massive carpet bombing raids on German cities at night. The goal? To completely cripple Germany's ability to even wage war. Now this number, 50%, is just staggering. Think about that for a second. In the early days, American bombers flew unescorted. They figured their altitude and all their defensive guns would be enough protection. They were so wrong. Advanced German fighters just tore through the bomber formations. On some of those missions, the loss rate approached 50%, a coin flip chance of coming home. So with losses like that, something had to change, and fast. The solution was the development of long-range escort fighters that could actually fly with the bombers all the way to their targets and all the way back. This single innovation was a total game changer in the air war. It finally allowed the bombers to do their job more effectively while the fighters took on the German Air Force. All right, so the air war is finally starting to turn in their favor. And all this time, the Soviets are pressuring them for relief on the Eastern Front. So the Allies prepared for the final, decisive act in Western Europe, the long-awaited invasion of France. I mean, this was the moment the entire war had been building towards. And let's be really clear about the scale here.
Operation Overlord, which we all know as D-Day, was, simply put, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted in all of human history. Thousands of ships, planes, and soldiers were all mobilized for one single all-or-nothing assault on the beaches of Normandy.
And that was the billion-dollar question. I mean, the Germans had fortified the entire coast of France into what they called the Atlantic Wall. The risks were absolutely astronomical. The fate of the entire war in Europe was literally hanging in the balance on this one day. And if you want to know just how uncertain this all was, look no further than the man in charge, General Dwight Eisenhower. He was so unsure of the outcome that he actually wrote 2 messages to the press the night before. One announced the success of the landings. The other took full personal responsibility for their failure.
Well, as we all know, D-Day was a success, but that was just kicking the door down. The Allies then had to fight their way off the beaches and begin the slow, hard push across France. Paris was liberated about 2 months later. Hitler threw everything he had left into one final, desperate counterattack that winter, known as the Battle of the Bulge. But it failed, and it cost his army men and machines they just could not replace.
So, with the German army broken in the west, and the Soviets just relentlessly advancing from the east, the final chapter of the war in Europe was about to begin. The end was finally, truly in sight.
And 1945 is really where it all comes crashing down for the Reich. In January, the Soviets cross into Germany itself. In March, American forces cross the Rhine River. Then, in late April, you have this historic moment where American and Soviet troops actually meet at the Elbe River, cutting what's left of Germany in 2. Just a few days later, Berlin falls to the Soviets, and the war in Europe is over. So the fighting stops. Now the Allied leaders meet at Potsdam to figure out, what on earth do we do with Germany? They agreed to divide the country and its capital, Berlin, into 4 occupation zones. It was meant to be temporary, but it had really long-lasting consequences. Stalin also confirmed he'd finally join the war against Japan. These decisions, made in the rubble of the old world, were already redrawing the map of Europe for generations to come.
And that really leaves us with one last critical question. Victory in Europe was achieved, sure, but it came at a monumental cost, and it created a whole new set of problems. The lines drawn on the map at Potsdam, they weren't just temporary occupation zones. They would very soon become the front lines of a brand new, decades-long ideological conflict, the Cold War.